Hello, ladies and gentle Smurfs. Today, I'm going to smurf you a story about one small Smurf's magical adventure in the human world. Today's story is called Blue Moon Nursery, and it was written by Smurfette Hand on the fan forum bluebuddies.com. Blue Buddies is a fan forum for Smurf fans to share anything they want about the Smurfs, from their collections to... So today, I'm going to read you this story all the way back from July 2008, and I hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, let's get into this. It's going to be a long one. I came home to a single package waiting on my doorstep. A small wooden box with ventilation holes in one side and a live specimen label. The box had been addressed to a research lab down the road, but no return address. Normally, I would have left the box to be redelivered to the proper place, but I heard a faint noise emanating from it. It sounded like crying. Imagine my surprise when I opened the small crate. Inside the cramped confines on a coarse bed of wood shavings lay a baby Smurf. The poor creature looked up at me, trembling with fear and bewilderment, a single tiny tear rolling down his cheek. I wanted to reassure the tiny dear blue infant that I wasn't going to hurt him. I had never seen a Smurf before, and I tried to recall anything that I had read about them, particularly about baby Smurfs on the bluebuddies.com website. I looked down at him and touched his tail, and what a soft little squishy tail it was. I couldn't resist poking it. The Smurf baby initially flinched, but then a shy smile crept across his little blue face. He was enjoying my affection. Gazing at his adorable tiny face, I decided to give the baby Smurf's bulbous little nose a playful tweak. The baby Smurf giggled and began to wiggle his tail with glee. I continued to play with his little nose, relieved that I'd been able to bring the Lilliputian infant to a sense of ease so quickly. I realized that I'd have to contact the Blue Moon Nursery later to obtain special food and care, but I would truly like to keep him. According to the postmark, the little Smurf had been shut up in that dark box for a day and a half. The poor creature was exhausted, thirsty, and hungry. I let him sleep after feeding him. When he awoke, he was initially scared and disoriented, but I soon calmed him. The poor baby Smurf's pajamas were soiled. After some trial and error amid his squirming, I managed to remove them. Filling a small dollhouse tub with warm water, I placed the blue infant inside, and he was soon giggling and splashing about as I gently washed his tiny, delicate body and limbs. I'd wanted to wash baby Smurf's hat along with his pajamas, but when I plucked it off his head, he let out a startled yelp. Immediately covering his bald little blue scalp as best he could with his miniature hands, he began to whimper and sob piteously. He looked pleadingly up at me and at the little white Smurf hat that I held in my hand. I promptly placed it back on his head, and he sighed with relief. I found an old but clean sock and nudged the baby Smurf until he backed inside. It fit him nicely as a sleeping bag. I placed a pincushion under his head for a pillow, and turning the lights low, let him snuggle down and get some more sleep. After I got off the phone with the Blue Moon Nursery, I saw that the baby Smurf had awakened and was hiding in the sock which I had given him to sleep in. The timid little creature was still leery of me, but I eventually coaxed him out. While his pajamas were still drying, I plucked the naked blue little infant up and cupped his tiny warm body in the palm of my hand. The baby Smurf squealed with delight, rocking back and forth as he gazed up at me. I had an appointment at the nursery for tomorrow, but for now, I had a shopping list to follow, as the nursery staff suggested frozen Smurfberry juice, organic cotton cloth for diapers, vegan soap, non-allergenic stainless steel safety pins, and baby powder. The very next morning, I carefully dressed the baby Smurf in his clean little Smurf pajamas. His constant squirming and my fear of inadvertently harming his delicate body made the task rather challenging. I donned my jacket and then plopped the tiny blue infant into one of its spacious pockets. I went outside, got into my car, and started it. The baby Smurf was startled by the engine noise and dived to the bottom of the pocket. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him trembling. This was the first time I had taken him outdoors since I had found him in that stuffy shipping crate. I spoke to the tiny being in a reassuring voice, trying to calm him. I'd have stroked his tail again if reaching into my pocket to locate it wouldn't have been so distracting for driving. We were headed for the Blue Moon Nursery, which was located in a small town 30 minutes up the coast. From time to time, curiosity got the better of the little blue creature, and I would see him briefly poke his tiny little head out for a peek. At last, I pulled my car into the nursery's small parking lot, and going inside, met the receptionist with whom I'd spoken yesterday. A stern-looking nurse guided me down the hall, explaining that on the weekend, she was the only medical staff on duty. We passed by a windowed room, where a half-dozen or so baby Smurfs slept and played, attended to by a pleasant-looking lady that obviously loved her tiny charges. An armed security guard stood outside the door, Further down, we entered the examination room, and I tried to reassure the Smurf baby that it was okay. I took him out of my pocket and handed him over to the nurse. With an efficient hand, she immediately stripped off the tiny Smurf's pajamas and his Smurf hat, plopping him onto the cold metal exam table. The exposed little blue guy was a pitiful sight, shivering from the touch of the cold metal on his bare skin. He whimpered as he did the day before when I tried to remove his little hat. I was about to say something to the nurse about it, but she now acted like I wasn't even in the room as she went about the exam. When she produced any glass thermometer, I knew what was coming and simply had to look away, wincing with empathy when I heard the little creature's distressed squeak. At last, the ordeal was over, and my baby Smurf was declared to be in fine health. I finished up the paperwork in the reception area as the traumatized little being hid in my coat pocket. Later, back at my home, I consoled the little blue creature, affectionately stroking and squeezing its soft knob of a tail for nearly half an hour before he reverted to his playful and carefree demeanor. I thought that while the weekend nurse may have done her job by the book, I was still stunned that she hadn't made any effort to treat such a precious, sentient being with the dignity that it surely deserved. The weekend after I took my baby Smurf to the Blue Moon Nursery, I decided to bring the tiny blue creature outdoors. I carefully supervised as he frolicked through the grass of my backyard lawn. I had planned on watering the lawn today, so during the week I had purchased a miniature plastic swimming pool for the little Smurf. I picked up the wriggling creature and brought him over to the pool, in which I'd already filled with water and a tiny floating duck toy. Unhooking the safety pin, I removed the tiny scrap of organic cotton cloth that served as his diaper whenever I let him crawl around indoors. I had found a pattern online for making the special diapers, which were designed to allow the Smurf's tail to poke through. As soon as I placed the disrobed blue infant into the water and let it go, it squealed with delight and began splashing water all over the diminutive pool. Looking at the wee baby Smurf's soft little body, I felt suddenly compelled to poke his blue tummy. At first, the baby Smurf looked warily as my finger peered his abdomen. But once I began gently poking at it, he squeaked merrily. We played this game for a few minutes, and feeling comfortable with leaving him alone, I commenced to water the lawn. Summer had finally arrived. It turned out that the affectionate caretaker at the Blue Moon Nursery also made miniature baby Smurf clothes as a hobby, and sold a few of them. I visited the place during the week when it was safe to bring my tiny blue companion along, and purchased for him a sunbonnet and glasses to protect his delicate face from the sun's rays. By this time, I also named my adopted baby Smurf. I called him Blueberry because that's just what he looked like, a plump little ripe blueberry. Taking him home, I switched out his regular Smurf hat for the bonnet while he napped. When he awoke, he seemed pleased with the new headgear and eyewear, so I took him out to the backyard and let him play in the grass all afternoon. One day, Blueberry, my adopted baby Smurf, was playing outside in a new set of Smurf hats and pajamas that I bought him. While he was climbing on a toy mushroom that I had made, suddenly one of the pajama buttons popped off. The tiny creature stared around in bewilderment, feeling exposed below his soft, round little tail, but not quite able to figure out why, let alone while I was laughing aloud. Today, I met the caretaker from the Blue Moon Nursery while taking a walk in the small town's park. Blueberry was sleeping peacefully in a little sling I had made to carry him in. The woman also had a baby Smurf, a female with her that she carried in a miniature wicker basket. The little Smurf was dressed in lavender pajamas and glanced out at me shyly from behind the protection of her blanket as the lady told me her baby Smurf story. Her name was Dewdrop. Dewdrop was rescued in a raid on a warehouse used by exotic pet smugglers. She had been found in a pile of filthy, paint-soaked rags. She had bruises all over her tiny body, limbs, and even her tail, as if someone had been deliberately pinching her delicate blue skin. During her captivity, in lieu of Smurf berries, someone attempted to feed the poor little creature a salty cashew, nearly choking her. It took 3 weeks before Dewdrop wouldn't scream in terror at the sight of a human face upon waking up from a nap. Though she was now trusting to her adoptive human mother, lonely Dewdrop never played or otherwise interacted with the other wee little Smurf babies at the nursery. Apparently there were bruises on the inside that had never healed. As the lady finished her story, Blueberry woke up and started squeaking and waving his tiny, outstretched arms in the other baby's direction. The lady decided once again to try to socialize her wary little Smurf, and let me carefully place Blueberry into the basket beside her. Both baby Smurfs eyed each other, and then we saw something that defied explanation. From under the blanket, we can see a pulsating, heart-shaped glow emanating over Blueberry's chest. Within seconds, a similar glow appeared over where Dewdrop's heart would be. At first, they pulsed at different times, but then they eventually synchronized and beat it as one. Dewdrop smiled and squealed with joy, kicking her tiny feet under the blanket with excitement. Blueberry was similarly elated, and both baby Smurfs wriggled with glee in the cozy blanket, grinning and laughing together. When the glowing hearts finally faded, we picked up our respective Smurfs, trying to discern the source of this miracle, but gave it up. Blueberry and Dewdrop were both set down and allowed to frolic in the grass. They squealed and giggled, crawling after each other and playfully grabbing and squeezing each other's plump little blue tails. We wondered if this was the last of the miracles of having a baby Smurf to keep and love. Dewdrop's human mother and I eventually began to take turns Smurf sitting for each other. This afternoon, I watched as Blueberry and Dewdrop decided to crawl into the old sock they had used for Blueberry's sleeping bag. They got thoroughly lost within its dark confines, squeaking and giggling as they squirmed about. Eventually, I saw Blueberry poke his head out of the opening. A few seconds later, Dewdrop's rear end was tentatively backing out as well. She simply wasn't experienced with playing inside socks as Blueberry was, and had lost her bearings. I reached out and poked the tiny little creature's exposed round tail. Startled, it darted entirely back into the sock. Blueberry turned around, and with a delighted squeal, crawled after her. The day that Dewdrop, the baby Smurf, had been rescued is recounted in the journal of one of the customs agents who broke into the smuggler's warehouse. Upon gaining access to the warehouse, it became readily apparent that the smugglers were forewarned and had likely abandoned this place of operations in the middle of the night. There were various partially empty bags of animal feed piled in one corner, as well as a couple of empty cages. A metal desk's drawer opened to reveal an empty ampule of animal tranquilizer. We were going to tape the area off for later inspection when a faint noise drew my attention. Inside a wastebasket lying on top of a pile of dirty rags was what appeared to be a tiny blue humanoid creature's head. I thought back to a recent training seminar and wondered if what I was looking at was the seldom seen Smurf. Remembering that these sentient Lilliputians could speak, I was about to address it, but realizing at a second glance this was an infant of the species, a baby Smurf. What my daughter wouldn't give to be here right now. She actually made me take the photos of the baby Smurfs from last year's National Geographic and blow them up to poster size for her room. She even had the official life-size, which isn't very big at all, baby Smurf soft vinyl doll, the proceeds of its purchase going to the preservation of the Smurfs' habitat worldwide. The baby Smurf before me wasn't in good shape, however. The noise I had heard before had been its hoarse crying and sobbing. Looking up at me, the creature was visibly terrified. The diminutive blue being's body had been tightly wrapped in twine from chin to toe. The wee little infant strained futilely against its bonds, rocking back and forth between sobs. I picked the creature up, noting by the color of its trademark little hat that I was probably looking at the very rare female of the species. The bewildered thing's face was a mask of terror as I scrutinized it with fascination. The other agents had by now gathered around, and there was nowhere the panicking baby Smurf could turn without seeing a human face. I started to unwrap the twine, and when I finished, the poor little creature was naked, except for its little hat. I had guessed right about the baby Smurf. The rough twine had gouged into the baby Smurf's tender blue skin, leaving its impression deep in the flesh. The creature also exhibited signs of abuse. Minuscule bruises everywhere, including on the unusual little tail. I gave the tail a curious gentle squeeze as the little blue biped squirmed in my grasp, eliciting a frantic yelp of pain. Its pitiable appendage was still sore from being pinched by whomever the Smurf's former tormentors had been. Its tail also exhibited the telltale puncture mark of a syringe. The smugglers didn't seem to have considered this baby Smurf of any value when they had fled, which explained the rough treatment and the general disregard for its welfare. It would take a couple of days to process the creature. After that, my department would alert the Blue Moon Nursery. This little blue creature may not realize it yet, but things were going to change for the better. Its village was likely gone by now, so life among humans would be in its best interest. Saturday was once again my turn to babysit Dewdrop. It was raining, so I decided to keep her and Blueberry indoors. I had filled a plastic cat's litter box half full of cornmeal and set the two diminutive blue infants inside. The minute creatures were initially bewildered by the way their tiny hands and knees would sink slightly into the cornmeal whenever they attempted to crawl. Eventually, they became accustomed to this unusual environment and were soon romping around the ground meal, squeeing with glee as they flung tiny handfuls of the coarse yellow granules outside the litter box and onto the floor. Later that day, my attention was drawn back to the improvised playpen when I heard one of the baby Smurfs begin to cry. As I went over to investigate, I smelled rather than saw what was the matter. Dewdrop needed a diaper change, and probably a bath as well. I plucked Dewdrop out of the playpen and, peeling off her lavender pajamas, discovered the offending diaper. I unfastened the safety pin as she twisted in my grasp. Only when I had removed the soiled bit of cloth from her did she cease her sniveling. Blueberry stared questioningly up at me, wondering why I had taken away his playmate. "I'll bring her back in one piece, Blueberry," I assured him with a grin. I carried Dewdrop with me into the bathroom. The frisky little creature's tail was all aquiver with excitement as I held her tiny figure under a stream of warm water from the bathroom sink. Dewdrop emitted tiny squeaks of enjoyment as the hypoallergenic vegan soap covered her delicate blue skin with fragrant suds. She giggled as she waved her arms, trying to pop some of the bubbles floating in the air about her with her tiny blue fingers. When it came time to wash little Dewdrop's face, the poor thing started bawling and squirming hysterically when I inadvertently got soap in her eyes. There simply wasn't anything such as a no tears formula when it came to baby Smurfs. So sensitive were their little eyes. She tried to frantically rub her stinging peepers with tiny balled fists, so I pinned her hands behind her back and held her face upside down under the faucet to rinse the soap off. I drenched her little Smurf hat in the process, but at least I learned from experience with rinsing Blueberry that this way the baby Smurf wouldn't accidentally inhale any water and choke. It seemed that all baby Smurfs were very insecure without their hats on at all times, and this made bathing them all the more challenging. Eventually, the little creature's sobbing subsided as I finished rinsing all the suds off its blue skin. After I used a washcloth to dry the baby Smurf, I comforted her with a gentle squeeze of little Smurf's soft tail between my thumb and forefinger. "You see, Dewdrop, you're okay, and all nice and squeaky clean," I exclaimed, giving one of her tiny hands a reassuring squeeze as the baby Smurf sat in the palm of my hand and gazed up at me. I placed a fresh diaper on her and pulled on a clean pair of lavender pajamas. Blueberry squeaked and clapped his little hands when I finally dropped his playmate back into the litter box. I'd been gone for only a minute before returning to the kitchen to spray the whipped cream atop a cream pie I'd made to take to my compatriot at the Blue Moon Nursery. As I picked it up to place it into the refrigerator, a strange thought struck me. It was awfully quiet. Where was Blueberry? Then I remembered that I'd absent-mindedly taken him out of my shirt pocket and set him on the counter beside the pie. I suddenly heard a fit of coughing as a tiny blue head popped through the surface of the whipped cream. The baby Smurf's bewildered expression made me laugh with relief. "That was a close call," I exclaimed. "I wasn't intending to make a blueberry pie." One rainy afternoon, as I watched Blueberry sitting and babbling unintelligibly on the living room floor, I decided to check his diaper before getting ready to wash a load of laundry. My lady friend had just returned the wee baby Smurf upon taking her turn to babysit him, while I ran some out-of-town errands. Upon touching the diaper to feel for wetness, I took the liberty of giving his tail a customary squeeze as well, but one simply wasn't enough this time. I exclaimed, "Pardon me, Blueberry, but the way you look sitting right there and prattling in your little Smurf baby talk is just too irresistible." Blueberry stared over his shoulder at me in bewilderment as I commenced to repeatedly mash down on his plump little blue tail and diapered rump, pinning it to the floor and driving tiny squeaks from the little creature as if it were some pet's rubber squeeze toy. The little creature's blue tail flattened like a pancake under the pressure of my index finger, but as soon as I released it, the resilient appendage and equally soft and pliable rear end would spring right back into their original shape. "You're 10 times better than a whole package of Charmin bathroom tissue," I proclaimed in conclusion. At that moment, I half expected Mr. Whipple to walk into the room and say, "Don't squeeze the baby Smurf," in admonishment. Blueberry blinked up at me with a rather puzzled look on his face, making me laugh. I woke up at the screech of a smoke detector. Flicking the light on, I tried to ascertain the origin of the fire, but it was soon apparent there was none. The low battery warning had triggered the alarm. After shutting off the smoke detector, I found Blueberry rolled into a small little blue ball on the floor, gripping his pajama-clad feet tightly with his tiny face buried between his legs and trembling. I could see his tiny round blue tail poking through the seat of his PJs. I tried to pry the terror-stricken little creature's hands away from his feet and unroll him, but he started shrieking so hysterically that I stopped. Perplexed, I watched the baby Smurf in the throes of debilitating fear. Every time I tried to touch him, he'd flinch and cry out. Blueberry remained in that state for nearly an hour before he had the courage to lift his head. I ventured to pick him up at this point and encountered no resistance. Placing him into his sleeping sock, I watched over him as slumber finally overtook the poor, exhausted little thing. Apparently the human world, no matter how much I tried to make accommodations, was at times too much for the wee blue infant. For the first time, I started to wonder if perhaps Blueberry Smurf would be better off elsewhere. My lady friend from the Blue Moon Nursery and I found out about a conference hosted in part by SMURF, Smurfs Matters, Understandings, and Relations Foundation. The organization was a new NGO set up to address the issues involving Smurf-human interactions, limited as they were. We took my car. Blueberry and Dewdrop sat in the back, snugly in a special car seat that my friend devised. She truly had a knack for making small items. It was a 3-hour drive further up the coast from the nursery to the conference center. Security was tight, and I had to register and pass through a metal detector. Also, I wasn't allowed to bring in any container large enough to keep a Smurf hidden in. Apparently, the greatest single human threat towards Smurfs was trafficking, especially of baby Smurfs due to their exceptional rarity. We were allowed to bring our respective baby Smurfs in with us. Among a crowd of zoologists and politicians, my companion and I received much attention, for we were the only ones in possession of a baby Smurf. My friend waved some onlookers off as we made our way toward our reserved seats. Our shy baby Smurfs weren't used to the sight of so many humans in one place, and they clung fearfully to each other in Dewdrop's little wicker baby carrier. When the speaker was introduced, I at first couldn't see anything, but then something small climbed onto the podium, and suddenly an image materialized onto the auditorium's large projector screen. Magnified on it 100-fold was the speaker, a tiny blue-skinned woman wearing a pink dress, shoes, and a signature Smurf cap. The speaker was a Smurfette. So that's what an adult Smurf looked like. The petite creature introduced herself.
Smurfy afternoon. My name is Tattlerette. I imagine most of you are here because you want to better understand Smurfs and the consequences of recent human-Smurf relations, which only began to have significant impact less than a decade ago.
The azure-complexioned Thumbelina then commenced her speech with remarkable articulation. She began with the sporadic interactions between man and Smurf during centuries past. The significant incidents didn't occur until satellite images began finding Smurf villages all over the globe. She mentioned how the incidents of a dozen villages being discovered by poachers or smugglers, and how Smurfs had become the new hot item in the exotic pet market, especially baby Smurfs. She also mentioned international resolutions to define the basic rights of Smurfs in order to help protect them from abuse. Nothing had been made official, but a handful of biolabs had made an agreement not to use Smurfs for science experiments. I thought back to the day I found Blueberry in that box meant for the lab nearby and shuddered to think about what might have been. Driving past, I had seen the laboratory picketed by animal rights groups on several occasions. When Tattlerette at last reached the topic of baby Smurfs, I was especially attentive.
It's unknown where baby Smurfs actually come from, or how they even come into being, except that it's by some kind of enchantment. What is known is that they are always delivered to a Smurf village by a stork. There are two things that seem to cause such an event. The first is the astronomical phenomenon, known as a blue moon. It's said that on a night of a blue moon, a baby Smurf, or even twin baby Smurfs, come to a village where love is most needed.
It sounded very beautiful.
The other way, she continued, is loosely referred to as signaling the stork, which is performed by a married Smurf and Smurfette in private. I'm sure all of you know what I mean.
The tiny blue lady winked, and there was a short interlude of stifled laughter in the audience.
We Smurfs appreciate the goodwill of humans like yourselves, since we become rather vulnerable when our evasion techniques fail in the face of modern technology,
she concluded. A moment of silence passed, and then Tattlerette announced,
It has come to my attention that there are two baby Smurfs here in the audience. Would their guardians mind coming on stage so I can see them?
My friend and I stood, carrying the wee little blue creatures in the wicker basket. They'd been sleeping all the way through, exhausted as they were from the car ride. But suddenly they realized another Smurf stood before them, and they excitedly waved their tiny arms toward Tattlerette, and crying desperately out in tiny voices. We made our way to the stage as two plainclothes security guards flanked us. Blueberry and Dewdrop excitedly crawled out of the basket at Tattlerette's feet. The adult Smurf picked up Blueberry, and holding him in the crook of her arm, she squeezed and scratched the tiny blue infant's plump Smurf tail. Blueberry closed his little eyes and emitted a joyful noise I'd never heard from him before. It sounded like half purring, half gurgling. Dewdrop looked up enviously at Blueberry and Tattlerette, and lifted her bottom up toward Tattlerette as high as it would go, wiggling her stubby blue tail for attention. They seemed to be well cared for. What are their names? Tattlerette inquired as she gave the excited Dewdrop's tail an affectionate squeeze. Dewdrop and Blueberry, my friend answered. I simply had to ask Tattlerette, how did you get Blueberry to make that sound?
Well,
Tattlerette began.
Firstly, there's no substitute for the affection from an adult Smurf. Baby Smurfs are affected more deeply as a result. Secondly, during early development, baby Smurfs in some ways are like animals, so they often enjoy being stroked in a way similar that one of your human pets do. There aren't many humans in this world that actually treat the Smurfs, or especially baby Smurfs, with the kind of care and consideration that you two are. However, if you reach a point where you don't believe you can adequately care for your adopted baby Smurfs, I know of a protected village in Belgium that could take them in. They would be amongst their own kind and would be loved and safe. Well, at least safe as long as the humans there honor their promise to preserve the Smurf sanctuary.
We talked for a few more minutes, and then Tattle Red had to go. She had a busy schedule and a particularly difficult mission of getting humans to understand the increasingly vulnerable position of the Smurfs. When I brought Blueberry home, he was very sleepy and ready for bed. Before placing him into his sleeping sock, I sat the tiny blue creature on my pillow and patted his head. Then I laid him on his stomach and tickled his tiny pea of a tail until the baby Smurf erupted with a fit of giggling. While the wee thing was still breathless from laughter, I rolled it over and tickled his soft tummy as well. Alas, I couldn't invoke that sound from him that he made earlier in the Smurfette's arms. That had been the sound of pure joy, and I'd love to have heard it from my adopted baby Smurf once more. I tucked Blueberry into his sleeping sock, and with a final pat on his little Smurf hat, I said, "I love you, Blueberry." Blueberry smiled up at me and responded with a tiny beep. It was a cozy winter day, and Blueberry was babbling and clapping his tiny hands, sitting on my lap as I read the paper. As I was leafing through the advertisements for a major newspaper from across the country, a certain item in the pet adoption section caught my eye. There, somewhere on the other coast, a baby Smurf was evidently being housed and offered up, as if the tiny creature were a hamster or such. Actually, Tattlered had told me about the plight of captured baby Smurfs, even in the hands of well-meaning but ignorant humans, and how rarely they flourish in such captivity. The blue-skinned Lilliputian baby's name was Strawberry, and nevertheless looked happy and healthy in the newspaper photo. Blueberry seemed to pick up on my concern, and became quiet, and looking up at me, his teensy mouth opened, and out came a pipsqueak. I phoned my lady friend, Dewdrop's human mother, who worked at the Blue Moon Nursery as a general caregiver. Leaving a message on her answering machine, I told her about the ad, and asked if she could help find out if the Blue Moon Nursery could adopt the tiny blue infant. Otherwise, wee little Strawberry Smurf might end up in a cage at some wealthy person's house, eventually wasting away from lack of emotional support. Baby Smurfs may sometimes act like rodents, as Tadlerette had explained, but they were not meant to be pets for humans. I decided then to call the adoption agency myself. Perhaps I could hold off the adoption of this innocent little being until the nursery could make an offer. I picked up the phone, wondering what if Strawberry had already been out of their hands. I looked at the photograph again. The pesky little blue face beamed at me. Something about that tiny, innocent little face evoked such concern in me. What if someone like the reprobate that had abused Dewdrop had gotten hold of her? Tattlerette had said that over 50% of Smurfs, baby or adult, in human captivity, had been deliberately harmed at some point, and that 10% had even been... Someone answered the phone. Exotic Pet Adoption Agency, how may I direct your call? It turns out that Strawberry was still available, and within the week, I had taken a plane out to the agency with papers authorizing me to act for the Blue Moon Nursery. My friend was watching Blueberry while I was gone. She always took Dewdrop to work with her at the nursery, and now my baby Smurf was with them too, playing and napping with all the other baby Smurfs. I picked up Strawberry at the agency and signed the papers. If only she wouldn't show up on an X-ray security scan, I might have secretly brought her in my coat pocket on a plane, but she would have to ride in the pet compartment. Sedated by an injection in her tail, the baby Smurf lay on a heap of shredded newspaper in a cage for rodents. The tiny blue creature had been trained to drink from water dispenser meant for hamsters, and to eat dried Smurfberry food pellets from a tray, which was attached to the cage wall. Scattered about were a few toys, a plastic ball, and some alphabet blocks included. The staff at the Exotic Pet Agency said that usually they didn't dress Strawberry except for her Smurf hat. They remarked that for some reason she always seemed uncomfortable without her hat. They figured, though, that making her some matching pajamas and dressing her, rather than letting her crawl around naked, would make her look more appealing for the adoption ad picture and prospective owners. We tried to make it kind of look like a real baby, they explained. They also told me that many people were initially fascinated with the tiny blue creature. But after realizing that it couldn't perform many tricks, and simply played a bit, crawled, cried, and slept, they decided they didn't need something so useless. The staff members had adored her, though, lavishing all the affection they could spare, feeling almost as if Strawberry weren't just a pet. Eventually, Strawberry was introduced to the other Smurf babies at the nursery. She readily accepted her new home and siblings. This tiny blue infant was a cheerful creature for certain. By this time, I'd become the nursery's one and only authorized volunteer. That week, I brought Blueberry to the nursery, and Dewdrop's human mother let me into the room where the baby Smurfs lived. I spent a wonderful afternoon playing with Dewdrop, Strawberry, and my Blueberry, in addition to the other little Smurfs there. I gently poked at and tickled the soft, delicate little pajama-clad beings as they squealed, giggled, and tumbled and rolled about in the miniature playpen. During nap time, Strawberry fell asleep between Dewdrop and Blueberry. The three baby Smurfs had snuggled together under the same little blanket. I couldn't have staged a more precious scene. The Blue Moon administrator permitted me to snap the one picture of them together, as you may see. After all too short a time, we had to leave. I had to pry Blueberry's and Strawberry's tiny little blue hands off of each other as they sat side by side, looking up at me with dismay. "We have to go home now, Blueberry," I stated. "You'll see your little blue friends again." The truth was, I didn't want to go home either, but the nursery night shift was coming and I had to get home to sleep. I gave Strawberry and Dewdrop's tails each a squeeze, and a gentle little twist between my thumb and forefinger to reassure them. Then, plucking Blueberry up by the seat of his pajamas, I dropped him into my coat pocket and exited the building. On the way home, the Lilliputian infant popped its head up out of my pocket and looked at me forlornly. Keeping one eye on the road, I quickly grasped the baby Smurf's bulbous little nose before it could duck back into hiding. With the same gentle squeezing, twisting, and stroking I usually administer to the tiny blue creature's elastic tail, I produced the expected calming effect, in addition to a few merry squeaks and giggles. If this wasn't pure joy, then nothing was. Pom Pom was the first baby Smurf with a disfigurement that the Blue Moon Nursery had ever acquired. The shy male infant had been abandoned on a country road and found by the son of a farmer. The road next to the lad's farmer's farm was a favorite place for humans to dump their unwanted pets. One evening, while the young man was out performing pest control, he chanced upon the angry sound of some small animal fighting, and the agonized shriek of another small creature obviously in pain and distress. From across the road, he saw what appeared to be one rat attacking another rodent. Though both animals were the same size, the screaming rodent wasn't putting up any sort of fight at all. It was simply cowering as the aggressor chewed on the hapless creature's hindquarters. The lad raised his air rifle for a shot, seeing this as an opportunity to take out two pests at once. The lead pellet struck the earth just behind the attacking rodent and sprayed it with dirt. Startled, the rat scurried into the field and out of sight. As the marksman readied a shot for the pest left behind, however, he caught a better glimpse of it in the moonlight and hesitated. Curious, he approached the creature and was shocked. The tiny thing had no fur, and its skin was blue. Its hands and feet were similar to those of a human, only they had 4 digits instead of 5. The creature made no effort to elude him either. It merely hid its face in its hands as it lay on its stomach, shaking and sobbing. Against his better judgment, he picked it up to examine it more closely. The terrified little being stopped sobbing and, removing its humanoid hands from a tiny tear-streaked face, looked up at him, wide-eyed in terror. Watching the news about a raid in the area on exotic animal smugglers, he remembered the discovery of a baby Smurf and what it looked like. So that's what this thing must also be, he thought, turning the petrified creature to look at it from all sides. Upon studying it, he established 2 things: that it was a male of the species, it was completely naked, even its Smurf hat was missing, and that its fleshy blue tail had been completely chewed off by the rat. Carrying it back home and telling his father, they arranged to send it to a veterinarian. Soon after, Pom Pom was taken in by our nursery. My lady friend, who worked as a caretaker at the nursery, as well as making outfits for the Lilliputian blue babies, sewed a tiny blue Pom Pom onto the drop seat of the injured Smurf's pajamas to simulate the tail it had lost that traumatizing night. After all the time I've worked here, I've come to realize just how partial baby Smurfs are to their tails and to other Smurfs' tails, she said. It will never be the same for the poor little dear without his actual tail, but this substitute is better than nothing. Without anything back there at all, a Smurf simply doesn't feel like a Smurf. I was about to find out just how right she was. One day that I volunteered in caring for the baby blue Smurfs at the nursery, I was tasked with bathing the diminutive blue infants. I'd never actually seen Pom Pom without his PJs on. It was my friend's day off, and she was undoubtedly enjoying it with her baby Dewdrop. I brought Blueberry with me. Strawberry reached out her tiny blue arms to greet me with a hug when I entered the room. By this time, all of the baby Smurfs had become accustomed to me and knew that I was kind. I took down a clipboard with tasks to be completed and decided that bath time ought to be gotten out of the way so that the little blue creatures could play, nap, and eat for the rest of my shift. I'd become quite nifty at peeling off the baby Smurf's pajamas, but when I got to Pom Pom, the little creature squeaked and struggled in desperation. At first, thinking nothing of it, I stripped him naked and set him on the counter as I began to fill a miniature bathtub. I was so engaged with getting the water to the proper temperature that I'd failed to notice what was transpiring between Pom Pom and the other baby Smurfs. They were staring at him, and at his rear end in particular. While every Smurfling seemed to realize that Pom Pom lacked a tail, actually seeing his naked posterior was always a spectacle. Feeling the gaze of his peers, the morose little blue creature first sniffled and then burst into tears of misery as he clutched one of the bathtub toys, a tiny waterproof Smurf doll. Even he was ruefully staring at the misshapen stump that used to be his plump little tail. When I finally turned to look at baby Pom Pom, he was sitting in a puddle of his own tears. I hurriedly picked the poor thing up and washed him as fast as I could, pulling his PJs with the false tail back onto him before I cleaned any of the other baby Smurfs. Later, as I drove home with Blueberry blissfully nestled in my coat pocket, I thought about little Pom Pom. I began to wonder if there might be a surgical procedure that could at least restore the semblance of a Smurf's tail to the pitiable, tiny being. After making a few phone calls to various vet clinics, I finally found one that would actually examine Pom Pom and see if he could receive a prosthetic tail. Taking Pom Pom to the clinic, I let him ride in my coat pocket with Blueberry. My own adopted baby Smurf had become used to the noise of the car's engine, but Pom Pom hid at the pocket bottom, trembling and whining most of the way. The examination was even worse. Pom Pom squirmed frantically in the grasp of the vet as the naked little creature was poked and prodded with all sorts of devices. Finally came the good news. Yes, I believe we can restore his tail through a technique known as tissue expansion. We can insert a small silicone balloon expander back there under the skin and gradually fill it with salt water over a period of time. The Smurf skin should gradually stretch and grow, making the balloon roughly the same shape as the creature's tail. It could then be left in to keep the tail's shape. Over the next few weeks, I ferried Pom Pom from the Blue Moon Nursery to the vet and back again for his treatments. Though the procedure was not nearly as uncomfortable as true surgical restoration would have been, and fortunately a mere fraction of the price, Pom Pom still screamed whenever his new tail was accidentally bumped into by another baby Smurf. It would never have the pleasant sensitivity of his original tail, but the taut blue skin was still rather sore at this stage. I discovered then baby Smurfs have an alarmingly low pain threshold. No doubt these tender little blue beings were never meant to be hurt in the first place. Unfortunately for the Smurfs, the world itself was becoming an increasingly cruel place. When I brought Pom Pom back to the nursery for the last time, I gently set the soft little blue infant down amongst the other baby Smurfs, his new tail poking through the drop seat of his baby PJs. My lady friend had removed the Pom Pom that once served as his tail and namesake, affixing it to the top of his little Smurf hat instead. We'll always call you Pom Pom. Aww. I had arrived at the municipal shelter and signed in to enter the area where the animals were being housed. Another SMURF supporter had tipped me off that there was a Smurf baby being held here, and that its treatment by the staff was callous at best. The Blue Moon Nursery had room for one more baby Smurf, and I had been authorized to rescue the little one if possible. Any place with lots of large animals, especially of cats, made baby Smurfs very nervous, so my lady friend was caring for Blueberry back at the nursery during this excursion. I passed cage after cage of dogs, cats, and rabbits, until my guide brought me to a dingy little corner where there sat a small wire cage, just big enough for a little hamster. I was stunned at the sight before me. There in the confines of that little cage was an unusually small runt of a baby Smurf, and an adult Smurf. I've seen a Smurfette before when I met Tattlerette, but this here was the male of the species. The pitiful little baby Smurf had been trying to cover her smooth bare crown with a tuft of mildewed straw from the cage floor. By the forlorn and anxious look in his eyes, the sparse covering provided a poor substitute for the feeling of security baby Smurfs derived from their special little hats. Suddenly conscious of my staring, the grown Smurf's cheeks flushed in shame. The poor little creature had been divested of its traditional white pants and hat for sanitary reasons. I was about to protest the humiliating way that this sentient being was being treated when a new horror commenced to take place, as a brutish staff member appeared with a bucket of soapy water, 2 clothespins, and an extension hose. The Smurf's eyes grew wide in fright, and picking up the naked baby runt, clutched her tightly and back into the far corner of their cage.
You can't Smurf this to us again.
The tiny blue adult's voice squeaked in protest as the terrified baby Smurf started bawling. The worker ignored its pleas and, opening the cage door, reached out to grab them.
No, not the baby, please.
The runty blue infant yelped in pain as she was gripped tightly by one of her soft round ears and wrenched from the arms of her protector. The tiny thing was then repeatedly dunked into and swished around the bucket of soapy water, screeching and spluttering each time her little head broke the water surface. When the little Smurfling was lifted out for the last time, it was affixed to an overhead piece of twine by a clothespin, clamped onto her tender pea of a tail. The adult Smurf was grabbed next, squirming as he was subjected to the same routine, except that a piece of string was used to bind his wrists behind him, and he was hung by his bulbous, fleshy nose. I couldn't even begin to imagine how painful it must have been for the Smurf's big tender nose to be so tightly clenched by that clothespin. The adult male Smurf's tears flowed freely as he sobbed in abject misery. The wee little baby Smurf's hysterical squeals tore at my heart. Her soft, sensitive Smurf tail was being grotesquely squashed by that clothespin's grip, while her delicate, teensy eyes stung from contact with the soapy water. Finally, the man pulled the trigger on the hose's spray head, and aiming it, drenched the miserable little blue creatures with ice-cold water. He then took down each of the wet, shivering Smurfs and dropped them back into their cage. As the baby's crying died down to a pathetic whimper, I spoke up. "I need to take this baby Smurf to our nursery. She can't survive the treatment in here." I didn't dare overtly protest further, though. I wanted no red tape from these people to impede my rescue effort. My guide responded, "The baby is going to a pet store tomorrow. They already signed for it." He seemed to anticipate my next question. I don't know which shop it is, except that it's local. I left the shelter and immediately began looking up the address and phone numbers of every pet store in the area. I wanted to make sure I found the poor little Smurfling before someone else bought it. Most people didn't realize how much care a baby Smurf required, and after the novelty wore off, they usually were dumped at shelters like this one. I thought about the adult Smurf. There wasn't much I could do for him at the moment, but while my guide was distracted, I dropped a paperclip into the Smurf's cage. It had a simple lock on it, and perhaps the Smurf could open it. Anywhere had to be better than that place. Around the corner, I heard a sharp rapping on the glass, punctuated by someone barking, "Freak!" followed by adolescent chortling. I rounded the corner too late to catch the culprit. It was late afternoon, and the window belonged to the last pet shop on my list. On display inside a hamster cage was the obvious object of the teenager's torment. Startled by the sudden noise, the bewildered little baby Smurf had tightly curled into a quivering little blue ball. The shop owner had decided to tie a single pink bow about the little thing's tail. Entering the shop, I immediately inquired about purchasing the diminutive creature. As it turned out, while several patrons had been curious about it, no other offers to buy it had yet been made. Money exchanged hands, and I left the store with my new pet. I had to leave it locked in the wire cage during the drive to the nursery, lest the poor creature panic and crawl underfoot while I was trying to drive the car. Reaching the nursery, I set the cage down on the examination table. The nurse removed the little blue rodent and examined it thoroughly. The runt was kept in isolation for a couple days while its bruised tail healed, and my lady friend sewed it some especially small clothing. In the meantime, I checked back at the animal shelter and discovered that the adult Smurf had somehow unlocked his cage and escaped during the night. I hoped he'd eventually make it safely back home. It was known that some birds would allow Smurfs to ride them. Over the next 2 days, the traumatized little being learned not to fear the humans at the nursery. It would probably always be a little skittish, but the time had at least come to properly introduce her to her new home. The other Smurf babies crawled and scooted over to the tiny runt as I set her down in her lovingly made little pink outfit and hat. Curious squeaking ensued as teensy blue hands gently grasped at the newcomer's plump nose and tail. Having been accepted by the other babies, the little runt was soon crawling and tumbling about on the thick playroom carpet with the others. Their happy little baby Smurf noises and giggles filled the nursery. When nap time came, the little runt clumsily tried to climb into a small wicker basket where Blueberry already lay. I slipped my finger beneath her soft little bottom and gently lifted her until she rolled headfirst inside with a squeak. Tucking the little one beneath the blanket with Blueberry, I stepped away. Blueberry turned toward his new napping companion and began to softly coo as he nuzzled the runt's cheek with his soft blue nose. The little Smurfling appeared to enjoy his affection. Her adorable wee blue face beamed with happiness as she began cooing as well in a sweet little way I'd never heard from any baby Smurf. When the two Lilliputian infants finally drifted into a peaceful slumber, I noticed them holding hands. During the following several weeks, our newly rescued baby Smurf runt had become the darling of the industry. The tiny sweet being loved to rub noses with the normal-sized blue infants. Its tiny, squeaky voice was so endearing that the nursery staff almost never tired of hearing it. The fragile, undersized Smurfling was treated with the utmost care, even above and beyond the extreme gentleness we already afforded each baby Smurf. Thanks to our devoted care and frequent feeding, the runt slowly recovered the baby fat that she lost from her harsh treatment at the municipal shelter. She had an extra small baby bottle just for her little hands from which to drink freshly squeezed Smurfberry juice. Most of the time, though, one of us would carefully hold the bottle for her, patiently waiting for her to finish, regardless how much she dallied between her noisy, messy slurps and gulps. As some of the laboriously prepared fruit juice dribbled down her chin, it was wiped away with one of the tiny, soft, organic cotton napkins that my lady friend had made for the wee blue babies. Whenever the lovable little runt became upset or frightened, myself or another nursery staff worker would speak to it in soothing tones and cradle the soft, warm creature in a cupped hand. Taking its plump, pea-sized tail between thumb and forefinger, it would be given a series of little squeezes. We'd gently roll the soft, supple extremity between our fingers and caress it. In response, the precious baby creature would lower its head, close its eyes, and emit a happy cooing and gurgling noise. What we at the nursery loved most, though, was to tickle the little thing. The magical tinkling of the creature's laughter never failed to delight us. We'd use any excuse to hear that precious Smurf's merry laughter. After her diaper change, the wriggly little creature would always roll onto her back, and after poking its soft little tummy, someone would always tickle the extra sensitive, parchment-thin, light blue skin of her underarms. She'd let out a gleeful squeal and try to protect the ticklish spot by crossing her tiny limbs while rocking back and forth and giggling hysterically. On this particular afternoon, the little ones were playing a popular game of hide and seek. With a playful squeal, the runt dove into a pile of the nursery worker's uniforms scheduled for the washer, which I'd just sit down for a minute. The runt hid quietly in the heap without my realization. I gathered them up into my arms and carried them to the laundry room. I set the pile next to me in front of the dryer while I emptied the washer of its recent load, the Smurf's diapers. Somehow, the curious little creature had climbed into the dryer from the mound of clothes sitting before it. Without looking, I tossed in a sizable armload of the Smurf's recently washed little diapers. Each baby Smurf required an unbelievable amount of diaper changes per day if it were to be kept clean, dry, and happy. Neither was the noxious odor of a baby Smurf soiled diaper for the faint of heart. Only a truly loving person could shoulder the burden and properly care for the fussy, vulnerable little creatures. Our constant toil to keep the baby Smurfs healthy and happy was only possible because of our love for the little creatures. To the devoted staff and volunteers of the Blue Moon Nursery, these sheltered and coddled wee blue infants had become the center of our world. We had a motto at the Blue Moon Nursery. Baby Smurfs are magical beings created for one sole purpose, and that is for each of them to be loved unconditionally. I shut the dryer door and, setting it to maximum heat, pressed the start button. The diapers would stay toasty warm when dry. The baby Smurfs so loved the feel of a fresh toasty warm diaper on their smooth little bottoms after a changing. Returning to the playroom, I got down on my hands and knees, searching every nook and cranny for my diminutive playmates. I asked myself aloud in mock befuddlement, now wherever can those little Smurfs be? I was answered by one or two surprised giggles. Every time I found a little blue body crouched behind a stack of alphabet blocks, or under a cradle, the wee ones squealed as I exclaimed, "Gotcha!" and tickled their noses, ears, and tails. Systematically locating the hiding baby Smurfs, I plucked them up one by one and set them down in the playpen. Some of the simple little creatures actually believed themselves sufficiently concealed because they had merely hid their eyes with their wee hands. Their endearing naivete made me chuckle. I'd found all but one of them, the latest addition to our little family, the female runt. I wondered why I hadn't found her yet. Was there someplace I'd overlooked? Whereabouts I had last seen the dear, mischievous pipsqueak? My blood froze with apprehension when I finally became conscious of a previously unheeded thumping sound emanating from the dryer in the adjacent washroom. Diapers did not go thump in the dryer. Later on, we'd play back a recording from the baby monitor in the room during the accident's investigation. Just audible above the... Later on, we'd play back a recording from the baby monitor in that room during the accident's investigation. Just audible above the rumble of the clothes dryer's rotating drum, we heard the runt's frantic screams from within. Before the air had eventually become too stifling hot to breathe, that is. Each panicked, tortured cry was abruptly cut short by a dull thump. The wind must have been knocked from the screaming little creature's lungs each time she banged into the dryer's hard, scorching interior. In a near panic, I sifted through the hot but still damp little diapers and found the runt lying motionless with eyes closed in the pile. Her cute little pink Smurf hat had been knocked off her head. Fearing the worst, I yelled for help. I was holding the baby Smurf in my hand, and when I yelled, the infant stirred and a quiet whimper escaped her lips. Then, with a ragged gasp, she went limp. At that point, I didn't know if the baby creature was alive or dead. A couple nurses and my lady friend burst into the washroom. The nurses told me to follow quickly, and we all marched across the playroom past the startled baby Smurfs confined to the playpen. A couple nurses and my lady friend burst into the washroom. The nurses told me to follow quickly, and we all marched across the playroom past the startled baby Smurfs confined to the playpen. I followed the three women into the examination room with the runt. As terribly worried as my lady friend was for the runty Smurf, she dutifully returned to the playroom, trying to calm the shaking Lilliputian babes with a great deal of tail kneading and petting. Laying the motionless runt face down on a special little sanitary cushion on the exam table, I caught a glimpse of its body as the nurses carefully snipped away the creature's romper as I explained what had happened. When they had snipped away the runt's clothing, I drew in my breath at the awful sight of its bruised and reddened skin. It looked like it had been scalded from head to toe and swatted around by a couple of ferocious alley cats. Along with most of the Smurfling's body, its tender round ears, plump little bottom, and even its sensitive tail bore painful-looking contusions and redness. As the nurses slowly turned the tiny creature onto its back, I saw that the runt's bulbous nose, soft cheeks, tummy, and toes hadn't been spared. She also had a black eye. Perhaps worst of all to see was the delicate skin of her underarms that we so loved to tickle had been most dreadfully singed and bruised. I was dismissed and joined my friend in soothing our wee charges. The other Smurfs, including Dewdrop, Pom Pom, Strawberry, and Blueberry, were quite alarmed. Blueberry in particular seemed to sense something was very wrong and proved inconsolable. My baby Smurf's incessant whining heightened my own anxiety. The exam room's door opened just enough to show me one of the nurses' faces. Her expression was inscrutable, and all she said was, "You'd better take Blueberry and go home." That was the longest drive home I'd ever had. Halfway through the trip, the sun had set. Blueberry hunkered down, hidden in my coat pocket, and whining the whole way as I tried to soothe him. I kept the hand in my pocket with him to comfort the anxious creature, gently squeezing and stroking its quivering blue tail. When we reached home, as I picked Blueberry out of my pocket, he wrapped his tiny arms around my forefinger and tightly clung to it. I tiredly eased into a rocking chair, and sitting my baby Smurf down on my lap, I rocked the chair with the tiny blue infant still clinging to my finger. At some point in the night, both of us must have fallen asleep. By the morning, I'd phoned the nursery, sick with apprehension. To my relief, I learned that Runt had survived, but barely. Another minute trying to breathe that blistering, drier air, and she would have been asphyxiated. The nurse labored all night to save the creature's life. X-rays didn't reveal any broken bones, at least. Her skin was so badly seared and bruised in places that even gently touching it caused the baby Smurf to recoil and whimper pitiably. During the next few weeks, the nursery staff and I worked to help the badly injured little runt recover from her traumatic accident. The creature had to either lie on its side or its stomach on a special little bed, because the slightest pressure on its burnt and bruised tail would cause the remarkably sensitive appendage to explode with pain, eliciting an awful yelp from the tiny blue infant. The runt's seared, chapped, and bruised skin made changing its diapers an agonizingly painful ordeal for it. A sopping wet and soiled diaper would cause a baby Smurf intolerable discomfort, and before long the wee one would be irritably squeaking for attention. The poor runt, however, learned swiftly to stifle her complaints. The runt's silent suffering merely delayed the inevitable dreaded diaper change. Sooner or later, the dirty diaper's unmistakably noxious odor would betray her condition to us, undermining the helpless runt's feeble ploy. The sniveling little creature would look pleadingly up into our eyes, beseeching us please not to hurt her yet again. That sorry gaze of hers pained my heart greatly, and I'd often envision it whenever I closed my eyes. We'd always perform the diaper task as gently as we possibly could, but there simply wasn't a baby's wipe in existence soft enough. The undersized Smurfling's scorched, chapped skin, already stinging and inflamed by her baby mess, was appallingly sensitive, and she'd yelp louder and louder with each wipe. Even the extra gently formulated baby Smurf powder stung her sore bottom. This once routine, and often even fun when we used it as an excuse to tickle her, procedure now always began with an apprehensive whimpering and culminated in miserable howling with rivers of tears. As with Pom Pom, the runt's remarkably low pain threshold and frailty reinforced my convictions that these helpless, magical creatures were never meant for the harsh world of humans. Stuck in bed away from our playmates, the wretched creature became morose and frequently shed tears, moaning and blubbering most plaintively. In order to mitigate her ennui, I would personally treat her to a Smurf finger puppet show every afternoon in an earnest attempt to cheer the wee Smurfling. My lady friend had previously crafted an assortment of adorable little puppets, to which she sometimes entertained the baby Smurfs. I'd bring that puppet box into the exam room, and before the runt's eyes transform my fingers into Smurfs, baby Smurfs, Smurfettes, and friendly talking animals. The tiny baby creature would watch with great interest and sometimes clap and giggle a little, but those merry outbursts often made her sore ribs and limbs ache terribly, and she'd abruptly cease with a pained wince. Sometimes I'd be allowed to bring Blueberry with me into the exam room so that the babies could babble and hold hands. Blueberry always had a very soothing effect on the runt's nerves. My adopted baby Smurf's concern for his little playmate was readily apparent, and he never seemed quite at ease while at the nursery, unless he had a chance to see if the runt was okay. Also, he alone somehow understood never to touch any of the runt's numerous ouchies. We simply couldn't trust the other tiny nursery denizens not to poke at the runt's ugly, sensitive sores and contusions out of curiosity. Not all of our beloved baby Smurf's injuries had been physical. We learned from the night nurses that the runt had started to suffer recurring nightmares. They were probably about the accident. Her little limbs would begin twitching as she softly whimpered. The whimpering would grow louder as her limb spasms more violent until she'd awaken with a choking gasp, followed a couple seconds thereafter by a loud, piercing scream. The outburst would also rouse and set off the startled baby Smurfs sleeping in the adjacent room. Sometimes, she'd roll over in her sleep onto her fragile, injured tail. The resulting pain jolting her from slumber caused the little Smurf to wail and cry to the point of exhaustion, eventually dying down to hoarse sobs. Though I myself never knew exactly what transpired in these terrible nocturnal visions, the reader will be afforded a rare peek into the fragile psyche of this baby Smurf. The runt slides down the smooth surface of the dryer's interior. It's kind of fun, and she wonders if this is some new playground equipment. Suddenly, a heap of damp but clean diapers falls upon the runt and pins her down. A loud metallic clang startles the baby Smurf as the dryer door closes. The alarmed runt tries to cry out, but the mountain of damp cloth muffles her cries. Suddenly, that slick floor starts moving beneath her, and she's lifted up into darkness. She cries out, flailing her little arms, but finding no purchase as she falls, slapped about the face by tumbling wet diapers. Her cries are cut short as she hits the hard floor with a dull thump, her breath painfully knocked out of her. Over and over, the helpless, confused, and terrified Smurfling runt endures the frightening, painful cycle within the pitch-black confines of the running dryer. The metal walls and flying diapers start to warm, and before long are scalding hot, burning every bit of bare blue flesh that touches it. Soon, the organic cotton of her very own romper is charring the skin beneath. The air becomes scorching as well, and with each tortured breath, her lungs burn until she chokes, no longer able to scream. Over time, dead patches of the runt's burnt skin slawed off and were replaced by thin but healthy new light blue skin from underneath. As the pain of each washing and diaper change subsided, the runt's mood became more restless. We began placing the runt alone in the playpen so that it could crawl around without fear of getting her sore spots poked by the other babies. The weakened creature's gait was still a little wobbly when she had recovered enough to finally be reintegrated with her fellow Smurflings. It was a day we celebrated with fresh-made Smurfberry pudding for the little ones. All the nursery staff had shown up, and we each took turns carefully squeezing and stroking the recently healed Smurfling runt's sensitive round tail to her immense delight. Unfortunately, the runt's night terrors never abated, and she would wet herself at least twice as frequently as the other Smurflings. Because of the formerly painful experience with diaper changes, the poor runt still feared them, and the miserable little creature would suffer in silence no matter how soggy she became. It became standard policy among the staff to check the runt at least once every hour. In time, however, we could tell if the traumatized Smurfling had been soiled for a while, just by the singularly glum expression on its tiny blue face. Blueberry and I went home. I was relieved that the worst of the runt's recovery was over. She'd been in my thoughts every day as she was convalescing in that stark medical exam room. I just hoped that in time her hurts on the inside would heal as well. But these magical little beings were simply never meant to suffer horrors like this in the first place, and the final prognosis was uncertain. I prayed nothing like this would ever happen to my sweet little Blueberry. Before bedtime, I gave Blueberry a bubble bath. The special liquid soap made my baby Smurf's little body quite slippery, and he squealed and giggled as I tried to hold on to him and wash his ticklish places. He wore a special plastic bath hat, which I plucked off just long enough to wash the smooth crown of his head. I had only a few extra seconds before the tiny creature grew acutely nervous about his bare blue scalp. Bending down, I planted a quick kiss on the top of his little head before replacing the cute little security bath hat. Blueberry closed his eyes, shrugged his thin little shoulders, and emitted a happy giggle in reply. Unbeknownst to Blueberry, I often removed his Smurf hat during his nap time in order to kiss him. I was spending yet another happy afternoon playing with and helping to take care of the baby Smurfs at the Blue Moon Nursery. Sitting down on the carpeted floor, I produced a book as a couple of the curious infants approached, one crawling and the other scooting along on its rump, squeaking for me to pick them up. They were Pom Pom and Strawberry. A baby Smurf possessed two common methods of locomotion. It could crawl on all fours, or it could sit upright and scoot itself along for short distances. Strawberry, in particular, preferred scooting about the playroom floor on her little rear end. "Who wants to hear a story?" I asked in a friendly sing-song voice. The two tiny blue infants waved their tiny arms and piped up, squeaking eagerly. Strawberry and Pom Pom loved to sit huddled together in my lap and gaze attentively up at me, their soft, warm blue tails quivering with joy as I read to them from a baby storybook. The simple little creatures probably barely understood most of what I read, but the colorful pictures and the rhythm of my voice as I spoke softly to them in mother-ease alone was sufficient to soothe and delight the wee critters. I'd even given the two sweet little Smurflings their own miniature organic cloth pretend books with non-toxic dye so that they could read along with me. Sometimes I'd see the little dears holding these wordless playbooks and squeaking in cute intonations as if they were actually reading them in their best imitation of me. When I prepared to leave home, I cuddled each of the soft, warm, tiny blue babes for a goodly amount of time, giving Strawberry's responsive tail a series of gentle, tickling flicks. I gave Pom Pom's tail a gentle squeeze as well. The bulbous, fluid-filled sac beneath his posterior skin had eventually been filled with a synthetic gelatin, providing the delightfully soft and squishy consistency of a genuine Smurf's tail. Though the pleasurable sensation of a true Smurf's tail would always be absent, Pom Pom still appreciated the affection on an emotional level. To him, at least he had some sort of tail for his cradle mates to grasp onto, and kind humans to stroke. Tucking them snugly into their cradle, I fluffed their adorable little non-allergenic pillows for them to rest their weary heads. I promised to visit them first thing tomorrow morning. Luckily, I had been able to schedule another volunteer visit for early the next day, since it was a weekend, and the two baby Smurfs and I would have another wonderful day. Or so I had thought. It was early morning after the one and only night that a security guard couldn't make it due to mysterious car troubles. Blueberry had fallen asleep in my coat pocket during the hour-long drive. I pulled into my parking place and pushed the intercom button outside the front door to identify myself and be buzzed inside. There was no answer, so I tried again and again. I thought perhaps the nurse was still in the powder room, so I patiently waited for a few minutes before repeating. Still no answer, and now I was worried. Without the guard, the nurse had spent the night alone in the nursery with the baby Smurfs. Since I was only a volunteer, even though a very trusted one, I still couldn't be issued a key. I thought about calling one of the other nurses or my lady friend who lived in town to let me in and investigate. But before I could dial a number, I saw a car roll into the parking lot. It was the stern weekend day nurse reporting for her shift. I told her there had been no answer, and she let us both in with her key. The nursery was eerily silent as we split off to locate the night nurse. I repeatedly called out for the nurse by name as I walked down the main corridor, and was answered by a thump and a cry of my name from within the broom closet. "Get me out of here! The babies are in danger!" I unlocked the closet, and the night nurse burst out, running down the hall in a frenzy and into the Smurf's playroom. I followed her closely behind with growing alarm, mindful of my adopted baby Smurf still nestled in my pocket. He was now awake, and I could feel him shifting about and stretching with a baby Smurf yawn that was little more than a soft, tiny peep. We located all but two of the tiny little baby Smurfs cowering in nooks about the nursery playroom. The poor incontinent runt had wet herself hours ago, and most of the other blue little infants were terribly overdue for a diaper change. We couldn't, however, locate Strawberry or Pom Pom, and after an hour of searching the nursery, we came to the chilling conclusion that they'd been Smurf-napped by whoever had shoved the night nurse from behind and locked her in the closet while putting something away. The nurse had heard the wee ones' panicked cries, unable to come to their aid. The police were phoned, and within half the hour, the nurses and I made our statements in turn in the front office, all while trying to calm and clean the traumatized baby Smurfs as these new strangers investigated the nursery, particularly the closet and the playroom. Blueberry was especially sensitive, and picking up on the mood of the other Smurflings and noting the absence of Strawberry and Pom Pom, started whining anxiously.
Over the next 3 days, the mood was very tense at the nursery, and humans and Smurfs alike were affected. The poor little Smurfling runt started crying day and night from tummy cramps, and after checking and rechecking her diaper throughout the day, it was surmised that the creature's insides weren't moving. One of the nurses handed me a little bowl of Smurfberry pudding with something added to help the wee one get back to normal. Unfortunately, the Smurfberry's flavor could not entirely mask the disagreeable taste of the special additive. Anything that didn't taste like those sweet berries from the Smurf's fabled shrubs was simply unpalatable to the fluffy little creature's hypersensitive taste buds. I had the unpleasant but necessary task of force-feeding the tiny blue infant this special concoction several times a day. The little thing frequently gagged and almost choked as I tried to get it down its throat without any spit-ups. The baby Smurf would kick and squirm in her high chair as I held her tiny mouth shut until she had no choice but to swallow. I'd have to cuddle the wee babe and stroke its tail for quite a while in order to calm it after each feeding. The poor confused little thing couldn't understand why I was forcing her to eat that yucky stuff, and she soon stopped whining whenever she was hungry. No matter how badly the hunger pains gnawed at her little tummy, she dreaded eating more of that pudding. Around regularly scheduled mealtimes when all the nursery Smurf babies were fed regardless of appetite, the teensy runt would try to crawl off and hide from the caretaker's knee. The slow, clumsy, naive Smurfling's pathetic efforts to elude us were to no avail, and we'd always find her within minutes, cowering and peeking out from between her tiny blue fingers. This was not a game of peekaboo either of us anticipated with joy.
On the fourth day, the night nurse and myself were called into the police station for a follow-up in the investigation. Since there didn't yet exist any statutes clearly defining a Smurf's sentience or rights, the police had to treat the matter mainly as a case of burglary and animal theft. If ever caught, the perpetrator would get more jail time for simply locking the nurse in the closet than for any of the atrocities committed against our beloved Smurflings. Earlier this morning, our cyber specialist located these video clips hosted on a server somewhere outside the country. It had already been accessed several hundred times before he was able to hack the site and take it down. While the server may not be local, we have reason to believe that the video clip itself was shot and uploaded not more than a 2 or 3 hour drive from your nursery. The nurse and I sat in silent apprehension. I have to warn you, the subject matter is very disturbing, but we need at least one of you to identify the victims in order to proceed with the investigation. The detective opened a file on the computer desktop, and the movie snippet filled the screen and began to play. I watched the video clip in horror. Nothing could have prepared me for what we were about to witness. There were Pom Pom and Strawberry. Pom Pom's darling little hat with its fluffy blue pom-pom sewed on was unmistakable. The terrified little blue infants each were hogtied and dangling in midair, crying their little hearts out. Strawberry's adorable little pink PJs with the words "Little Miracle" printed on them were torn off and lay on a rough-looking workbench below. Occasionally, we'd hear a man's coarse laughter between our beloved Smurfling's tortured sobs. Seeing from the video how much the 2 baby Smurfs' diapers sagged told me that they had been unpleasantly sodden and soiled for a very long time, perhaps for a day or even longer. Poor little Pom Pom flushed miserably as his ersatz tail was ridiculed. The cruel man jabbed at it with its finger. "What's with your misshapen tail, you deformed little blue freak?" his masked captor sneered in a digitally disguised voice. Then the helpless Smurfling's soft, tender, bulbous little blue noses and tails, which they so loved to have caressed at the nursery, were each viciously pinched, jerked, and twisted repeatedly. A Smurf's nose was tender enough, but there was nothing so sensitive as a Smurf's bulbous tail. I blanched at those tied Smurflings' sharp, frantic screeches of pain. They were like nothing I'd ever heard before, and I would rather have gone permanently deaf than to hear those poor, suffering, tiny blue infant creatures' shrill outbursts of unmitigated agony. In the next scene, they howled as each was taken in turn by their floppy, round Smurf ears, which were also given a series of merciless wrenches and twists. Strawberry was then untied and allowed to fall. The diapered Smurfling's posterior hit the workbench with an audible, wet, and squishy-sounding plop. The diaper was yanked off as the tiny blue infant was pinned face down on the workbench's nicked and greasy surface. The man's other hand came back into view, brandishing what appeared to be a short section of flexible plastic track for toy cars. As Pom Pom dangled above, he stopped crying and gaped in abject disbelief as Strawberry was slapped repeatedly on the rear with the length of track. The Lilliputian infant's face contorted and went purple as it yelped with each sharp, resounding smack. The shocked, soggy, and sobbing Pom Pom was untied and dealt with next. The poor Smurfling thrashed and screamed wildly as it was spanked. When it was over, the 2 stunned and exhausted little creatures lay face down, sobbing breathlessly. Their tender, plump little blue bottoms were covered in reddish welts. Neither of the tiny blue creatures had ever been remotely treated like this before, and they couldn't believe this was really happening to them. Strawberry especially had never experienced any real pain in all her sweet young life, nor had any human ever abused her, and the shock of this nightmarish cruelty, after being so mollycoddled at the Blue Moon Nursery, threatened to destroy her fragile psyche. From off-camera, their tormentors' raucous laughter eclipsed Strawberry's and Pom Pom's plaintive mewling. In a later part of the clip, Pom Pom had been grabbed and was being dunked headfirst into a pail of water. He was held halfway under as he writhed wildly. I could see his legs kicking frantically in the air and his bruised and swollen Smurf tails panicked quivering. The diminutive baby creature was powerless in its torturer's grasp, and was mercilessly immersed for intolerably long periods of time. Upon the brink of drowning, the suffering little infant would be brought up only long enough to have any water squeezed from its aching little lungs and to take a couple of desperate gasps of air before being shoved back underwater. I simply had to turn away from another awful sight of the final clip, but not before I saw someone's hands unscrew a bottle of hot pepper sauce and deliberately rub it into helpless Strawberry's delicate, moist little eyes using a cotton swab. It was the same type of swab we would use to gently clean the baby Smurf's big, soft, floppy ears during their bath time. Her piercing shrieks exploded from the computer's speakers and froze my blood. Periodically, these terrible scenes were brightly illuminated by the brief flicker of what must have been a camera's flash. What sort of depraved beast would do something like this to an innocent, lovable little baby Smurf? I found the very idea of deriving amusement from intentionally hurting such a precious, magical being inconceivable. This reminder that some of us humans possess such a capacity for wanton cruelty made me positively ill with shame and revulsion. I heard a sniffle beside me. Instinctively, I took out my handkerchief, and without looking, placed it into the nurse's hands. The lady had only to blot away a single tear before regaining her composure. "We'll find them," I tried to reassure her. "We'll get our babies home." I wish I believed it myself. I didn't look forward to bedtime that night. I stayed up into the small hours of the night until I was exhausted enough to fall asleep immediately. Those images of Strawberry and Pom Pom would haunt me relentlessly whenever I lay awake in the dark. As it would turn out, the next night I would be visited by a member of SMURF Hardliners, a small secretive group of Smurfs and humans who in the past had made headlines with their more proactive methods of protecting Smurfs' rights. Though I didn't exactly have a direct line to their cell, I had left an urgent message for Tadlerette. The Smurfette had no official ties to SMURF's more radical arm, but the message was somehow passed along, and they had learned of our dilemma. Presently, I heard a soft tapping on my bedroom window, and looked out. I saw a Smurf. I was positive that he was the adult Smurf who I aided in escape from the municipal shelter. I leaped up and opened the window to let him climb in. Instead of the traditional white pants and hat, he wore an urban camouflage knit bodysuit and hat. Slung across his back was a canister of pepper spray with a special trigger to fit a Smurf's hands. No doubt this was used to repel cats and terriers and probably people too.
I want to thank you for smurfing me that paperclip,
he said in his tiny voice. I wish I could have done more for you, I replied ruefully.
We know about your Smurf-napped babies. We also have their possible location smurfed within a very small radius. We'll try making a move tonight, but before I go, I could use your phone.
Of course. I hurriedly grabbed the cordless phone and set it down beside him. Blueberry was snoring away amidst this whole interchange. I don't know what the Smurf said, but within minutes, a car pulled up into my driveway. The Smurf waved goodbye and hopped out the window. Moments later, the car, himself, and his no doubt human accomplice were gone. I closed and locked the window and lay on my side, gazing at Blueberry in his tiny cradle. I wouldn't sleep tonight. As I lay awake that night awaiting news from the SMURF militants, my thoughts drifted back to those video clips I'd seen of Pom Pom and Strawberry, imprisoned and abused by that pitiless ogre. The reprobate Smurf napper promptly got down to business with the terrorized little beings. Firmly grasped in his captor's hand, Pom Pom cried in alarmed bewilderment as he was forced to watch Blueberry. His beloved nursery mate let forth blood-curdling squeals as her sensitive, bulbous Smurf tail was brutally crushed until it nearly burst. The vile human beast seemed to particularly enjoy hurting the wee Smurfling's most sensitive appendages, their tender noses and their soft, squishy tails. To so viciously abuse a baby Smurf's tail is perhaps the most painful and emotionally destructive act one could inflict, as the wee infant's tail is intertwined with its most basic feelings. It's meant as a special means to soothe and comfort when gently squeezed or stroked, and this affection is just as vital to the tiny blue babe's well-being as their specialized Smurfberry diet.
Simply the idea of that disgusting fiend rudely disrobing our precious baby Smurfs and sullying their naked little bodies with his rough, filthy hands made me seethe. In the video clips I had been able to see the revulsion and discomfort reflected in the eyes of the man's tiny blue captive. The Smurflings would visibly shrink away from the wicked man's violating leers and flinch at the touch of his coarse fingers on their delicate, bare, cerulean flesh. Baby Smurfs by nature were innocent beings, and not typically body-conscious around their peers or familiars, be it they Smurf or human. My own baby Blueberry, in fact, often romped and rolled about, squealing with unabashed delight, sky-clad save for his little Smurf cap whilst I cradled him in my hands or lap. We at the nursery always treated our beloved little charges' bare bodies, especially their private places, with the utmost reverence. Bath time in particular was a magical time for caretaker and cherished Smurfling alike, with much squeaking and giggling as we caringly scrubbed the little one's soft skin with extra soft and sterile disposable little sponges.
The SMURF activists had eventually pinpointed the IP address signatures left by the Smurf Napper's transitions to a cul-de-sac where a run-down abandoned house lay. They accurately surmised that this was a likely place to hide the captives, and picking the front door lock, they entered stealthily. Searching the house, they found no trace of the man who'd taken the Smurflings, but when they broke down the double-bolted door to the basement, their luck changed. When the Smurfs' rights guerrillas finally found our 2 missing Smurflings in that dark basement, they were greeted by a most horrific sight. The wee babes were stripped naked on a greasy, splinter-ridden workbench in the cold, damp air. Their cute pajamas and hats were nowhere to be found. Pom Pom's ribcage was crushed between the jaws of a pipe wrench as he strained for breath, while Strawberry had curled herself into a little ball nearby, but facing away from her nursery mate. Both the creatures' magical little hearts were glowing, but this phenomenon was much different than the joyous one had once witnessed when Blueberry miraculously healed Dewdrop. Rather than the healthy golden light, a sickly greenish aura had materialized around the precious baby Smurf hearts. Lastly, a thin, jagged, vertical fissure had split each heart down the middle. Had Pom Pom remained pinioned betwixt the brutal jaws of the pipe wrench for a few more hours, the poor baby Smurf's arms would become too tired to lift, and its tightly constricted, tiny lungs would surely have given out. Pom Pom's toes were bruised from the weight of the hard metal wrench sitting on them. His little knees were swollen and ached at the slightest flexing, causing him to burst into tears each time the rescuers attempted to loosen them up. His spindly legs were painfully cramped, and several days passed before the brutalized wee blue babe would even crawl again. Perhaps worst of all was the state of his prosthetic tail. While mashed in the jagged metal teeth of the wrench, the little gelatin-filled sac which gave Pom Pom's tail its shape had ruptured and the gel leaked out. The poor Smurfling was left with a flattened and shriveled length of blue flesh that flopped limply about like a deflated balloon. The destruction, yet again, of this little creature's prized appendage had a devastating effect upon his psyche, and I knew that we would need to have the prosthesis beneath his skin surgically replaced as soon as his other injuries healed. Those last few hours before the rescue had played like a dark, eternal nightmare for the 2 blue waifs, where time slowed to a snail's pace. Strawberry had gaped and whined in horror as she forced to behold the harrowing spectacle of the cruel man clamping Pom Pom's soft little naked body in the toothed metal jaws of a pipe wrench. The fiend forcibly folded Pom Pom's little legs up so that his knees pressed into his chest and screwed the wrench closed until the baby Smurf's ribcage was nearly crushed. Each merciless turn of the wrench's screw forced a sharp, agonized squeak from the pinioned baby Smurf's lips. Pom Pom now had to lift his scrawny blue arms up each time to draw a short, tortured breath. With an ugly chortle, the man remarked that he'd return later, positioned an activated web camera on a tripod aimed at Pom Pom and Strawberry, and then left the basement. Strawberry tried frantically, but hadn't the strength to loosen the pipe wrench, nor did the tiny creature know quite how anyway. Unable to help Pom Pom, the little Smurfling gave up in tears. There was no way for her to climb down from the workbench either, and a sheer drop to the cement floor below would have splintered most of her delicate Smurf bones. Trapped on the workbench, with the horrid sounds of Pom Pom's agonized, rasping breath, and the sight of his contorted, sweaty, tear-streaked little face was just too much for Strawberry. The distraught, terrified, naked baby Smurf eventually gave up. She curled herself into the trembling little Smurf ball position that distressed baby Smurfs instinctively assumed, and began keening at a heart-rending pitch. At that moment, both their tiny hearts were shattered, and though the simple creatures could not grasp the concept of death, they sensed they were nearing a dark place from which they would never return. It wasn't until 5 hours later that their liberators discovered them. One of the human activists was so enraged by the brutality he'd witnessed that he wanted to plant a surprise triggered by a thin wire midway down the stairs for when the Smurfnappers returned home. Cooler heads prevailed, and they instead called in the location of the house via 911 before slipping away. Within the half hour, the cul-de-sac was ablaze with the flashes of red and blue police lights. Unbeknownst to the activists, and only later discovered by the police, was the warning system the Smurfnapper had installed. At several locations in the dark house, there had been hidden tiny microphones linked to a laptop computer in the attic. In absence, the wily Smurfnapper had been able to monitor whatever input came to that laptop over the internet. Thus forewarned, the man would never return to the house now, and had a booby trap been left for him, it would have instead triggered against the first innocent person to descend those stairs. Police were unable to find any fingerprints, any clues on the old laptop, or pin down where it was transmitting. The house had been abandoned for some time, and none of the neighbors had witnessed anything unusual. The Smurfmapper might as well have been a ghost. Even if this had been a crime involving a human victim, All the investigative effort and legal power in the world would have been futile in finding this cunning fiend, as this was merely the case, albeit an extreme one, of animal cruelty. The resources allotted to such an investigation would be paltry. As for the SMURF hardliners, the later realization that they'd been outsmarted, despite the successful rescue, was a blow to their morale. Some of them even theorized that the Smurf napper might have deliberately left an internet trail for them to follow, and had set the entire awful scene up for them to find. Before dawn, I was called at home and instructed by a Smurfette's voice to drive to the nursery immediately. When I reached the parking lot, I was at last confronted by the cell of SMURF hardliners. They were an intimidating lot. The group consisted of several salty-looking men, women, and Smurfs. In addition to the 4 humans, there was 1 Smurfette and 3 adult male Smurfs, including the one I'd helped escape from the municipal shelter. I was overwhelmed with relief at what they brought, and Blueberry popped his head out of my jacket pocket and squeaked excitedly, waving his spindly blue arms. Pom Pom and Strawberry were clothed in spare generic organic cotton pajamas and had been freshly cleaned, diapered, and fed with vitamin and electrolyte-enriched instant Smurfberry juice, and dinky little Smurfberry energy bars. A special unguent, made by the matriarchs or patriarchs of Smurf villages, had been spread on the baby Smurf's many cuts and contusions. A more liberal amount of the Smurf's antimicrobial healing salve had also been applied to Pom Pom's and Smurfberry's entire diaper areas, for their bestial captor had forced them to endure nearly 2 days wearing those same wet, filled diapers. Diaper rash was endemic with baby Smurfs whose caretakers did not heed the rule of keeping the wee charge's wee, plump blue bottoms dry. Any longer than a few hours in an unchanged diaper ran the risk of the Smurfette's vulnerable skin contracting such a rash. This particular region of poor Strawberry and Pom Pom's flesh was now so raw and irritated that it would be nearly a week before it healed. Once the painful welts from the spanking subsided, both Strawberry and Pom Pom would be scooting on their rumps around the nursery playroom's hypoallergenic carpet, more as a way to scratch their itchy rears than going anywhere in particular, squeaking most irritably and occasionally pitching fits from the frustration of this relentless discomfort. As a balm to their little blue souls, the wee magical infants had also been furnished with cuddly plush emergency comfort dolls, bearing the reassuring likeness of an adult Smurf. The dolls' tails were even filled with a gelatin that emulated the squashy feel of a real tail, and were proportionally larger. The exaggerated tail size, a symbol of soothing pleasure to a baby Smurf, could be more easily grasped by the wee blue infant's chubby blue little fingers. A distressed baby Smurf could squeeze the doll's tail to bring some relief to its own anxiety. It was a vicarious experience for the little Smurfling, as if in comforting the doll, its own responsive tail was being gently squeezed. The hardliner's sensitivity to the delicate elfin infant's basic physical and emotional needs, and their imaginative stopgap measures to meet them, impressed me. Pom Pom's stubby little fingers were wrapped around the thumb of the adult Smurf embracing him. He was the one I'd helped escape from the municipal shelter, and whose activist codename was Paperclip. Both Smurflings started squeaking in a distinctive pattern when they saw me, a plaintive look in their big round eyes. As he listened, Blueberry's face slowly shifted from joy to comprehension, and then to dismay. He began blubbering. "What are they saying?" I inquired concernedly as I gazed at my beloved little blue infant's friends, while gently patting my crying Blueberry on his little head and letting him hug my finger. The Smurfette, tenderly holding Strawberry, answered, her eyes glittering dangerously with anger as she spoke. "They're saying in baby Smurf talk that he hurt me, he hurt me, he hurt me." Some of the hardliners were of half a mind to not even return the Smurfnap babies to us, unimpressed with our failure to safeguard them from harm. I pleaded with them to allow us to bring Strawberry and Pom Pom back to our nursery. I stated truthfully that no better day-to-day care for the high-maintenance little blue infants existed anywhere outside of a Smurf village, and that all of the known Smurf villages were already strained to capacity trying to care for orphan baby Smurfs. I pointed out that their activist cell likely didn't possess the stable environment, nor for many resources, both material and human, that were required to truly keep the wee blue infants healthy and happy. The Smurfette's voice was filled with reproach, and I hung my head in humility.
Nevertheless, see that you do Smurf better procedures to ensure these baby Smurf security, or we may have no choice in the future but to liberate them from your nursery's care. And I mean all of them.
It took no convincing on my part that she was deadly serious, and if they decided to, could swiftly and deftly confiscate all the tiny inhabitants of the Blue Moon Nursery, no matter how the nurses and I would try to thwart them. In a few days' time, Pom Pom's and Strawberry's tails and noses were no longer too sore to be touched if done carefully. Despite the added expense, the Blue Moon Nursery hired an extra licensed caretaker just to stand by during the 12-hour night shift. Her sole duty was to cuddle, speak in a gentle, reassuring voice too, and stroke the wee ones' little tails and noses whenever they awoke screaming from the frequent night terrors spawned by their recent ordeal until they settled down. It typically required nearly an hour of undivided attention from the caretaker to ease the emotionally vulnerable little baby creatures before tucking them back into their electric auto-rocking cradle. This procedure wasn't effective with Pom Pom's deflated tail, as the poor creature longed for it to be filled out again. Eventually, the nurse decided only to caress and squeeze Pom Pom's bulbous Smurf nose in lieu of his tail, because the self-conscious little tyke merely cried with grief every time he felt someone touch his pathetic, flaccid remains. The SMURF hardliners had informed me that because of the repeated near-drowning they had been subjected to, the two Smurfling waifs had acquired a phobia of water, even if only an inch deep. For now, the nurses would have to give them sponge baths, wetting and rinsing the sponges at the sink, because even the sight of a full water bucket would fill the whiny, diminutive beings with trepidation. Their days of merry giggling and squeaking as they splashed about in little basins with floating bath toys and bubbles were over. I hope not forever. Despite the relief I felt from the return of Pom Pom and Strawberry to their nursery home, there was one detail about the crime scene I learned of that would stick in my heart forever. The SMURF hardliners had not searched the basement extensively. Shortly after they had located our missing Smurflings, these activists carried them to an awaiting van where the Smurfette and others fed, cleaned, and clothed the two distressed blue infants as they drove. Later, when the police conducted a more thorough search of the basement, someone found the tiny, months-old bones of a tiny baby Smurf skeleton in the interior of a grimy old pizza box in one of the workbench's bottom drawers. The baby Smurf had been a bashful, runty male named Snickers, which had been reporting missing from a pet store 6 months ago. Besides its picked-over bones, there was an adoption ad clipping with a picture of it smiling and hiding under his security blankie. The same tattered little blanket was found threaded irreverently through the skull bone's eye sockets, besides its moldy Smurf hat. That night, after tucking Blueberry into bed, I had to tenderly squeeze and knead the sniveling creature's tail for nearly an hour before he stopped whining. I then patiently waited until I heard the peaceful rhythm of his tiny snores. Getting up, I quietly walked out into the backyard and gazed solemnly up into the starry night sky. Rivulets of salty tears began streaming down my cheeks as I wept for Snickers, a precious baby Smurf whose joyful little squeaks would never again enchant this world. The days grew shorter as winter approached, and I reported for a Saturday morning volunteer shift in the twilight of pre-dawn. This day marked the 4th week since the rescue of Pom Pom and Strawberry, who remained horribly traumatized with no sign of abatement and continued to live in isolation, especially Pom Pom. We still hadn't the funds to repair his Smurf tail, and the tiny, self-conscious creature gradually sank into a deep depression. If anything, the two Smurflings were getting worse, withdrawing more into themselves with every passing day. It was a cause of alarm for us. We'd heard tales of these emotionally fragile baby creatures eventually dying of a broken heart and spirit. Halfway through my trip to the Blue Moon Nursery, as Blueberry slept cozily in my overcoat pocket, wrapped in a tiny sleeping bag like a little blue burrito, I caught a glimpse of a lone bird in the sky. The avian flyers seemed to be headed in the same general direction as I. By the time I'd made it into town and had to stop at an intersection, the creature was flying lower, and I got a good look as it soared overhead. I didn't know my birds all that well, with the exception of owls. I never let Blueberry play outside in the backyard after dark because of them. Ornithologists would eventually discover owl pellets containing the indigestible remains of a Smurf, or even baby Smurf. By the bird's silhouette, I initially thought it might be a pelican. It was a plausible guess, being the town was situated near the coast. When I arrived at the Blue Moon Nursery, a nurse came outside to meet me and noted the bird circling overhead. As the bird swooped down and landed next to us in the parking lot, I realized that what I'd previously thought to be the capacious underbelly of a pelican's beak was in fact a bundled white neckerchief clamped in the beak of a large male stork. The nurse and I stood in shock, still as the bird approached us, or more specifically me, its payload gently swinging like a tiny hammock. Somehow the intent of the flying being seemed readily apparent to me, and I knelt before it, cupped hands outstretched. The stork stood vigilantly before us after he lowered the white bundle onto my waiting hands. I carefully unfolded the white organic cotton handkerchief. Blueberry popped his head out of my pocket, and the Smurfling, the nurse, and I gaped speechless as the tiny blue creature within was revealed. A newborn baby Smurf. The creature's silky skin was a lighter blue than that of older babies, and it was so little that even the runt would have dwarfed it. It lay sleeping and naked except for a singularly tiny Smurf cap pulled snugly onto its little head. Although the nurse and I had to peer very closely at the minute creature's front diddy area, we concurred that it was a male. Blueberry gasped as he spied a never-before-seen feature on the new Smurfling's belly, a heart-shaped birthmark. No one knows where or how baby Smurfs actually come into being, or who folds these handkerchiefs, or places those first tiny Smurf caps upon their wee blue heads. This was especially true for those few magical ones that would stay babies forever. It's been theorized that those enchanted ones are created for the sole purpose of being something to be loved and cherished. This may very well be one of those, but that a stork would ever deliver any such dear being to a human was unprecedented. Gingerly, I placed the dormant newborn baby Smurf in my bare but warm palm. It felt so soft and fragile, I marveled that the teeny thing didn't just fall apart when I touched it. I looked toward the stork with questioning eyes. The great fowl merely chirped once and flew off. I guess we had our answer. The wee tender thing was ours. Going inside and walking cautiously, I followed the nurse toward the infirmary's small, never-used neonatal room. As we tiptoed through the silent nursery room, the lady beckoned to the surprised caretaker watching over the cradle of sleeping babies. Reaching the infirmary, I carefully held the sleeping miracle in my hand and patted Blueberry's head with the other, while the two women began preparing the baby Smurf incubator for its new resident. We turned our heads at a soft little squeak as the tiny creature suddenly stirred in my hand. Blueberry whined quietly with awe as we watched the newly stork-delivered baby Smurf slowly awaken for the very first time in this world. The nurse explained that its eyes would not actually open for another 24 hours. The blind creature instinctively reached up with its spindly arms and peeped expectantly. I placed my index finger before his tiny blue mug, and the Smurfling found it, grasping either side of my fingertip with his incredibly minuscule hands. At that moment, my heart overflowed with the most profound adoration. My perceptive Blueberry was the only baby Smurf we could trust with the privilege of getting such a close look at this tiny wonder during its most frail initial state. He alone knew better than to poke and prod at the blue pygmy's heart-shaped birthmark, despite his conspicuous curiosity towards it. Nor would the understanding Smurfling go for a squeeze at the little newborn's darling tail or nose. Especially the nose. If grabbed prematurely, risked an interruption to the creature's fragile respiratory system that could cascade into total collapse within minutes, ending the tiny thing's life before it even tasted its first Smurf berry. Baby Smurfs, when delivered to a Smurf village, must always be carefully shielded from toxins, infections, temperature anomalies, loud noises, and physical trauma by the magic of the village's patriarch or matriarch during their most vulnerable first weeks. I marveled at the singular opportunity I'd been blessed with. I could have held that wee little miracle until the end of time and be happy, but I had to carefully hand it over to the nurses. There would be time to fawn over the sweet thing later. The nurse carefully placed it in the baby Smurf incubator and prepared a sterile eyedropper of warm, pasteurized Smurfberry juice. As one nurse closely monitored the wispy blue infant, another snatched a book off the shelf and rifled through it. She thought she'd never actually need, from delivery to diapers, special care manual for newborn baby Smurfs. I was carefully sorting and folding dried Smurf diapers in neat stacks according to their owner. Some of the baby Smurfs, like Blueberry and Strawberry, had personalized diapers with colorful prints that they often wore. This certainly made extra work for us as we had to wash them separately from the plain ones, but we usually didn't mind. The wee Smurflings looked so adorable in them, and hearing their gleeful squeaks and giggles as they saw us exchanging their dirty plain diaper with one of their favorite printed ones was ample compensation. The specialized but necessary care afforded to the baby Smurfs at the Blue Moon Nursery was costly, and we occasionally ran into the red. While outsiders were almost never permitted to enter the baby's living area, we had started a small gift shop selling postcards, t-shirts, bumper stickers, buttons, and even DVDs, which, though quite expensive, sold surprisingly well. Along with these purchases, a small pamphlet was always bagged. This informative tract, provided courtesy of SMURF, was meant to raise general awareness amongst humans that baby Smurfs were indeed young sentient beings, not some fully grown, strange, hairless lemur. It also told about the general plight of Smurfs and orphan baby Smurfs in captivity, where some were physically abused, given inadequate food and emotional support, or even exploited in ways too revolting for me to describe. The Vice Police, however, uncovered evidence of such exploitation from time to time on underground websites. Also highlighted was how the Blue Moon Nursery protected and met these magical blue infants' special needs. Included was a menu of the few Smurfberry dishes the pampered little ones were regularly served. Printed on the backsides of the pamphlets was a picture of a caged baby Smurf whose fate is unknown. Its expression and posture would have garnered sympathy from the most hard-hearted person. Above its plaintive tiny blue face read the caption, "Please help me." This is where the pamphlet segued into the advertisement for our most lucrative fundraising method, the Adopt a Baby Smurf sponsorship program. The adorable appearance of the little blue creatures greatly endeared themselves to many people, and we'd eventually set up a program where individuals or businesses could sponsor their own baby Smurf. Each sponsor initially received a life-size plush doll bearing the approximate likeness of the particular baby Smurf they'd chosen, dressed in a genuine organic cotton baby Smurf diaper, previously actually once used by their chosen adoptee, beneath its adorable hat and pajamas. Each month, a letter with a photo and a brief update on the Smurflings' activities was mailed to those who pledged a certain sum of money per month. Currently, every little Smurf in the nursery had at least one benefactor who adored them from afar. The darling little Smurfling Runt had gained over 24 sponsors or fans since she'd been given sanctuary at her nursery. These funds themselves were pooled for the benefit of all the blue Lilliputian babes. For exceptionally large donations, in addition to hanging a plaque in honor of the generous soul in the nursery, they would receive a short DVD video each month highlighting their favorite baby Smurf's antics and care. Subscribers were overwhelmingly fond of the magical bath time videos, which was always a special bonding experience between nurse and Smurf. I myself always look forward to bathing my little baby Blueberry. The tactile sensation of the bubbly elfin infant's bare blue skin as I held it in the bath basin and caressed it with a tiny organic loofah sponge was a religious experience. Sometimes we'd also send a copy of a finger painting done by the baby Smurf. The whole arrangement facilitated a one-way vicarious relationship for the sponsors toward their little beneficiaries. Caring for the nursery's tiny new delivery was going to run us well over our present budget, so we placed ads in the local papers announcing this wondrous new arrival in order to garner some more badly needed donations. A cute quarter-page photo of him was featured, showing off his adorable heart-shaped birthmark. The portrait of this sweet, diminutive, blue-skinned creature quickly ensnared a gaggle of new sponsors. The teensy-weensy wee little doll with its heart-shaped birthmark awarded to the newborn creature's backers was to die for. Its tiny little Smurf cap in one of the actual baby's authentic, previously worn diapers was absolutely precious. In our online store, we had a live video feed on the newborn's incubator, while announcing the great moment had finally arrived, the baby Smurf's first diaper being filled. An auction to become the first sponsor of the tiny miracle ensued. Presenting the winning bidder with her prize the next day, she actually blinked away a tear of sentiment when she first held that tiny scrap of organic cotton, as she reflected on the fact that it once tenderly enfolded the fragile Smurfling's nether region and faithfully absorbed his whittle messy. Nearly everyone seemed to want to chip in to help out this irresistibly cute little wonder. Nearly. During the week of the advertisement campaign, the Blue Moon Nursery secretary had discovered an email containing disturbing images sent to our inbox. The first was a malicious, digitally manipulated image involving the newspaper picture of the newborn Smurf and a small animal guillotine like the one I'd heard was sometime used for euthanasia in the laboratory near where I lived, the one that Blueberry was nearly delivered to so long ago. Seeing the image of such a sacred, innocent little being twisted in such a stomach-turning manner boiled my blood. It was obvious this harassing email's author was none other than the demented Smurf napper who'd so recently sullied the nursery's inner sanctum with his presence. Along with that abominable fabrication were several more horrifying photographs of Pom Pom and Strawberry while they were his captives. Lastly, at the bottom was a shocking image of what I recognized as the baby Smurf Snickers, or more accurately, Snickers' corpse. The ravaged Smurfling's nude body was suspended upside down from a string. A few inches further up the string was knotted around his well-chewed baby pacifier. The ill-fated baby Smurf had been teething when he was abducted. When the police discovered his skeletal remains, there had been a single teensy baby Smurf tooth among the bones, dislodged from the skull. Snickers' microscopic incisor had borne a telling pattern of scratches on the enamel, the kind of marks a pair of needle-nosed pliers would make. Beneath this photo was a taunting caption in the Smurf napper's meandering scrawls. Even during his final death throes, the bashful little blue rodent was trying to cover his shame. It was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. Ha 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 ha. I hurriedly shut off the computer monitor and turned my head. I'd almost put my fist through the monitor CRT as a flood of emotions welled up. I'd never before seen a Smurf's corpse. Within hours, a deceased Smurf's skin gradually fades from its vibrant blue hue to a dismal gray. The secretary and I suddenly shifted our attention to my coat pocket. Blueberry, I thought frantically. He woke up and I didn't notice. My adopted blue Lilliputian baby had wriggled itself out of its burrito-sized sleeping bag and was curiously peering out of my coat pocket. eyes wide as saucers. His tiny fingers gripped the pocket rim as if frozen as his bulbous little blue nose hung just over edge, appearing for all the world like the ubiquitous cartoon character Kilroy. Too shocked to look away, Blueberry had been transfixed by the email images like a deer caught in car headlights. Even after the monitor was off, he couldn't tear his gaze away. I hastily pushed his little head down and out of sight, crumpling his Smurf hat in the process. Once the dinky tyke could no longer see the computer monitor, his paralytic spell on him was broken. There was only one reaction to those awful visions one could expect from a baby Smurf. In the snug confines of my coat pocket's interior, Blueberry tightly curled into a trembling little Smurf ball and began wailing at an ear-splitting pitch. He cried himself hoarse, flinching when I gently poked at the soft, plump round tail, poking through the hole in the seat of his PJs. There was nothing I could do but wait for the sensitive being to eventually calm down on his own. I dearly wished Blueberry and I had never glimpsed those images. The aching pain in my heart for that ruined, innocent baby little Snickers flared up anew. I vowed, if by some twist of fate this murdering fiend should fall into my hands, I would not turn him over to the police, but to the SMURF guerrillas, where justice would be sure and swift. The following afternoon, I'd alerted the police and the SMURF about the email, hoping the meandering scrawl of the sender's handwriting would provide a clue as to his identity. Activist Paperclip replied the next day by email and explained that after their analysis, they determined that the message had not been actually written by hand, but with a widely available fractal-based program designed to simulate the subtle differences of handwritten letters. The wording of the diminutive blue bipedal gorilla's email betrayed his distress at the digital image of Snickers' hanging corpse, despite his attempt at professional detachment. Who wouldn't have been moved, especially an adult Smurf? The stress of the recent events and the little runt's previous accident continued to have a profoundly detrimental effect upon her touchy gastrointestinal tract. Unfortunately, she wasn't responding to the foul-tasting medicine for her rather painful problem, each day leaving in her diaper such tough and measly deposits that we became quite concerned. More drastic measures were indicated. On Saturday morning, Miss Somez, the particularly insensitive weekend nurse, was determined once and for all to cure the tiny Smurfling's sluggish innards. Nurse Soames plucked the dinky blue infant out of a corner as it hid cowering behind a smiling Smurf's head pillow, grasping it in its wee four-fingered hands like a shield. As the nurse hauled the petrified creature to the infirmary, I followed in tow. I wanted to ease the wee blue patient's fears. Soames deftly stripped the petrified runt naked, save for her little pink hat. As soon as the being's plump little bare bottom made contact with the chilly stainless steel exam table, it yipped and commenced to shiver. I tried to calm her by stroking her quavering little tail. The confused baby Smurf looked on with apprehension at the strange and ominous-looking collection of medical paraphernalia that Nurse Somez was bringing out of an overhead cupboard and arranging neatly on a sterile tray right beside it. The nurse then repositioned a table-mounted magnifying glass above the runt. The runt gazed up through the lens, trembling at the nurse's gigantically magnified visage. "I'm sorry, precious angel," I said as I gave the hapless blue patient's tail a little final squeeze. The puzzled, shivering, and naked runt looked to me for reassurance as I backed away, reaching out with its twiggy arms and whining for me not to leave. Feeling squeamish, I had to turn away, unable to witness the impending invasive procedure, and left the infirmary at the nurse's orders. While departing, I winced as I heard a string of startled, high-pitched baby Smurf squeaks, followed a few seconds later by unhappy little groans of discomfort and blubbering. The other baby Smurf's keen, floppy round ears had picked up the runt's distressful noises and ceased their play, casting me many a worried, anxious glance. Ever since the harrowing experience of having their happy little sanctuary invaded by that vile Smurf napper, and watching petrified as two of their own were spirited away, every nursery Smurfling sat on the edge of unease, startling at the slightest untoward noise. The nursery Smurflings gathered round me for comfort, my Blueberry included, squeaking and whining with concertation on their tiny faces every time they heard the runt resume its frightened, discomfited squealing from beyond those metal doors. I'd become engaged in trying to calm the tiny cerulean-skinned beings, dutifully caressing those ever-receptive bubble-wrap-shaped organs of bare flesh poking out through the little designated holes in the seats of their cute, organic cotton pajamas. The blue hands of the playroom's single Smurf-faced clock ticked off the passage of a quarter, then a half, then 1 full hour. Finally, I felt a gust of air when those infirmary doors flew open, startling the wee babes gathered in my lap, as Nurse Somez strode into the nursery room with the now rather shaken and humiliated runt grasped firmly in hand. "That ought to do it," she proudly proclaimed as she unceremoniously plopped the freshly diapered Smurfling back down onto the thick, carpeted floor. Grimacing and blushing, the pitiable little creature kneeled over to its side, crossing its arms over its stomach and groaning miserably. There'll be some residual abdominal spasms. Can't be helped, I'm afraid. These babies' digestive tracts are just too touchy. I spent the next couple hours trying to pacify the discomfited runt. I gently rolled the tiny blue infant onto its back, and with one finger, I began petting his protuberance of a nose. Somas had pinned the new diaper too tightly to the runt. The pressure on its sore tummy soon made little things start kicking and wailing. I unfastened the pin to loosen it. Then with one finger, I pulled the front of the diminutive creature's diaper partway down and gingerly massaged the lower quadrants of the suffering Smurfling's painfully cramped belly. Blueberry had begun to experience nightmares himself and was more fretful than usual ever since he had inadvertently saw those torture pictures on the computer. For the first time ever, I was permitted to volunteer for the night shift to assist the other nurses at the Blue Moon Nursery. There were 3 of them altogether. The temp nurse, whose job was to console the traumatized Strawberry and Pom Pom, the one who attended and cared for the fragile newborn laying in the baby Smurf incubator, and the general head nurse. I brought Blueberry with me, of course. Pom Pom and Strawberry were morose, fretful, and lethargic. The nursery staff feared for the wee one's well-being, as the wee blue babes slowly wasted away, despite the intensive care they were receiving. When their precious, enchanted hearts had broken before the shocked eyes of the SMURF gorillas, they feared that it would take more than hot Smurfberry soup and being tucked in a warm, quiet place with all their little stuffed toys to save the sensitive Lilliputian infants. At around 1 a.m., Pom Pom and Strawberry began to whimper and writhe in their troubled sleep. They were having another nightmare. The whimpering and fretful squeaks of the tiny blue infants slowly rose in volume until they awoke as one, in tiny, heart-rending screams of terror. The 2 babes were kept in a separate, soundproof, convalescent room at the nursery, lest they alarm the other blue-skinned pygmy young with their frequent nocturnal lamentations. Nevertheless, the runt, still traumatized from her own misadventure in the dryer, would whine and sob often, somehow able to sense the distress. In the main hallway hung a framed, larger-than-life photograph of each baby Smurf the nursery had ever taken in. Blueberry, who always seemed to possess a bit more acumen than his diminutive peers, awoke and began to squeak intensively for attention. Picking my teensy Smurfling up, I cuddled its soft, pajama-clad body gingerly, petting its little flesh bulb of a nose as I looked into its big round eyes. "What is it, Blueberry?" I asked quizzically as he continued squeaking. Blueberry waved his tiny, ungainly arm toward the wall with the photographs. The next couple of minutes played out like a game of hot and cold, as the little creature led me to 3 photographs and made a hugging gesture. The pattern of the little squeaks and the gawky but distinctive arm movements were reminiscent of the day when he'd first met Dewdrop, and the miracle I'd witnessed of Blueberry's glowing, healing heart. After explaining to the nurses what we'd intended, a large cradle enough for several Smurflings was brought into the quiet room. In it were carefully placed the tiny, delicate bodies of the depressed Pom Pom and Strawberry, the disturbed runt, and Blueberry. Blueberry squeaked something in baby Smurf talk, and the 4 wee babes snuggled side by side, linking their soft, skinny arms and holding hands. The temp nurse and I watched in wonder as Blueberry closed his eyes and his blessed wee heart began to radiate with a golden light. The other 3 baby Smurfs began to calm, and soon each of their hearts appeared to mend as they too visibly glowed. They engaged in a chorus of soft squeaks and sighs as their tears finally dried upon their cherubic little blue cheeks. Within a few minutes, the miraculous Smurf hearts once again faded back into the sweet blue infants' chests as they descended into a deep slumber. At least for the remainder of this night, no bad dreams would plague the 4 little nursery mates. The healing had finally begun. The end. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Have a good night.